"This is our house now, Dad. Get out, my daughter," Sarah said, throwing scalding coffee across my chest. I stumbled backward, burned and betrayed, watching the woman I'd raised alone transform into a stranger, wielding forged documents claiming I owed $400 0 inches gambling debts. At 68, they thought I was just another helpless widower they could intimidate and rob. Her husband, Carlos, blocked my kitchen doorway, tattooed arms crossed, explaining how I had 5 minutes to pack before they changed the locks. What Sarah and Carlos didn't know was that I'd been hiding something for 3 years, something that would turn their perfect crime into their worst nightmare. But what I discovered next would change everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The October morning light filtered through my home office window, casting long shadows across the desk where I'd been working since sunrise. At 68, I discovered that retirement didn't mean slowing down. It meant finally having time for the things that truly mattered. Like my food blog, Desert Flavors had started as a simple hobby 3 years ago, just a way to document the incredible restaurants scattered throughout Phoenix and Scottsdale. But as I uploaded the final photos from last night's review of Bourbon and Bones, watching the professional quality images populate my screen, I couldn't help but smile at how far it had come. My phone chimed with the familiar notification sound. Another comment on yesterday's review of that new Vietnamese fusion place in Old Town. "Timothy, your descriptions make me feel like I'm sitting right there with you, heading there tonight because of your recommendation." These messages never got old. After 30 years of engineering where success was measured in structural integrity and load calculations, having people genuinely excited about my writing felt like discovering a hidden talent I never knew I possessed. I clicked over to my email, and the familiar surge of satisfaction washed over me. 3 partnership offers from local restaurants, 2 requests for sponsored content from food brands, and my monthly revenue report from the blog's advertising network. The number at the bottom made me shake my head in amazement, $3,247 for September alone. Combined with my pension and Social Security, I was living more comfortably than I ever had during my working years. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sarah had been so worried about my finances since her mother died 8 years ago, constantly asking if I needed help with bills or groceries. If she only knew that her old man had accidentally stumbled into a second career that was more lucrative than anything I'd ever imagined. But I'd learned to keep my successes quiet. Margaret had always resented my expensive hobbies, and after her death, I'd found peace in not having to justify every dollar spent on a nice dinner or a weekend trip to review some acclaimed restaurant in Sedona. My coffee had gone cold while I worked, but I didn't mind. The routine had become sacred rise at 6 coffee, and the morning news then straight to the computer to edit photos and write reviews while my mind was sharpest. The engineering habits died hard, everything organized, everything in its proper place, everything done with methodical precision. The house reflected that same careful order. After Margaret's death, I'd gradually rearranged everything to suit my preferences. The living room now faced the window overlooking my desert garden, where barrel cacti and palo verde trees created the perfect backdrop for my morning routine. The kitchen counters stayed clear except for my coffee maker and the small notebook where I jotted down recipe ideas inspired by my restaurant visits. I'd just started reviewing the photos from a new steakhouse in Carefree when I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Glancing at the clock, I frowned slightly. 8:15 on a Tuesday morning wasn't exactly visiting hours, but then I saw Sarah's silver Honda through the window and felt that familiar mix of pleasure and mild concern that came with unexpected family visits. Sarah had been struggling since her divorce 2 years ago, and her recent marriage to Carlos hadn't seemed to settle things as much as I'd hoped. She'd been working retail management at one of the big box stores, but I knew money was tight. Carlos had been in and out of construction jobs, and they'd been living in a cramped apartment on the other side of town. I saved my work and closed the laptop, straightening my desk with the same precision I'd once applied to engineering blueprints. Through the window, I watched Sarah sit in her car for a long moment, staring at something in her lap. Even from this distance, I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she was gripping the steering wheel. When she finally emerged from the car, she was clutching a manila envelope against her chest like a shield. Her smile looked forced as she walked up the flagstone path I'd installed last spring, and something about her gait too quick, too purposeful, made my engineer's instincts prickle with unease. I met her at the front door, genuinely happy to see her despite my concerns. "Sarah, sweetheart, what brings you by so early?" Her smile stretched wider, but it didn't reach her eyes. There was something brittle about it, something rehearsed. "Hi, Dad. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just working on the computer. You know how at Island. I stepped aside to let her in, noting how she kept that envelope pressed tightly against her chest. Coffee's fresh if you want some. Actually, Dad, she said, her voice carrying that particular brightness she'd used as a child when she wanted something. I have a surprise for you. Sarah's fingers trembled slightly as she held out the manila envelope, and I noticed she wouldn't quite meet my eyes. It's about Carlos, she said, her voice carrying that forced brightness that had worried me since she'd arrived. He's gotten himself into some financial trouble. Before I could respond, I heard the front door open behind her. Carlos stepped inside without knocking his work boots heavy on my tile floor. He'd never been one to wait for invitations, but something about his presence this morning felt different, more aggressive, more territorial. He crossed his arms and leaned against my kitchen doorframe like he owned the place. "Morning, Tim," he said, though his tone lacked any warmth. "Hope you're ready to help family." I looked between them, noting the way Sarah deferred to him with quick, nervous glances. Whatever was in that envelope, they'd clearly rehearsed this moment. "What kind of trouble are we talking about?" Sarah thrust the envelope toward me with hands that were definitely shaking now. Just open it, Dad. It'll explain everything." The envelope was heavier than I'd expected, thick with documents that rustled as I tore along the seam. Papers spilled across my kitchen table, official letterhead, legal forms, what looked like credit card statements. My engineer's eye immediately went to the organization of it all, noting the neat arrangement, the careful presentation. "These are gambling debts," I said, scanning the first document. Las Vegas casino letterhead and account summary showing a balance of $47,000. I picked up another paper, Atlantic City, $63,000. Then another from some riverboat casino in Louisiana I'd never heard of, $89,000. "Keep looking," Carlos said, his voice flat. "There's more. There was. Much more." Credit card statements from banks I didn't recognize, loan agreements with terms that made my stomach clench, casino markers with interest rates that seemed criminal. Every document bore the same name, Timothy Lewis. Every signature looked exactly like mine. $400,000, Sarah whispered, and I could hear tears starting in her voice. "Dad, you owe $400,000, and they want it paid by Monday." I set down the papers and looked at my daughter, really looked at her. The tears were real enough, but something about the timing felt off. Too perfect, too well cued. "Sarah, I've never been to half these casinos. I've never even been to Louisiana. Memory isn't what it used to be at our age," Carlos interjected, moving closer to the table. "Those signatures look pretty authentic to me." He was right about that. I picked up one of the credit card applications, holding it closer to the light. The signature was mine, not just similar, but perfect. Every loop of the T, every slant of the L, even the way I pressed harder on the downstroke of the E. If I didn't know better, I'd swear I'd signed it myself. "I need my magnifying glass," I said, standing and moving toward my desk drawer. 30 years of engineering had taught me to examine details others might miss, and something about these documents was nagging at me. "Dad, please," Sarah said, following me. "We don't have time for that. They're going to start seizing assets if we don't pay by Monday. The house, everything, then we'll have time for a proper examination." I pulled out the magnifying glass I used for small print and returned to the table. Under magnification, the signatures told a different story. The pressure was wrong. When I sign my name, decades of habit create specific patterns where I press harder, where the pen lifts slightly, the natural rhythm of muscle memory. These signatures were too consistent, too perfect. Real signatures have variations, tiny imperfections that come from the natural movement of hand and wrist. "These aren't my signatures," I said, quietly setting down the magnifying glass. Carlos stepped forward, his bulk suddenly intimidating in my small kitchen. "What are you saying, old man?" "I'm saying someone forged my name, very skillfully, but forged nonetheless." I spread several documents across the table, pointing to specific details. "Look at the ink flow here and here. See how uniform the pressure is. Real handwriting has natural variations. This is reproduction work." Sarah's tears had stopped, and for just a moment her mask slipped. I saw something cold and calculating in her eyes before the desperate daughter act resumed. "Dad, you're overthinking this. You've been under a lot of stress since Mom died." "My stress levels don't change my handwriting mechanics," I interrupted. "And they certainly don't explain how I supposedly gambled in 3 different states on the same weekend." I picked up a cluster of documents comparing dates. According to this, I was in Vegas, Atlantic City, and Biloxi simultaneously last March. The silence that followed was telling. Carlos's jaw tightened, and Sarah's eyes darted between the papers and her husband's face. Besides, I continued my engineer's mind working through the logistics. I keep detailed records of my activities. Credit card statements, bank records, calendar entries. If I'd been traveling to casinos, there would be hotel charges, flight receipts, restaurant bills. None of that exists because I was never at these places. People forget things, Carlos said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I don't forget 47 trips to gambling establishments. I gathered the documents into a neat pile, my movements deliberate and controlled. What I want to know is who had access to enough personal information to forge these signatures this accurately. Sarah's face had gone pale. Dad, please. We're family. We need to stick together on this. Family doesn't forge signatures, I said, looking directly at her. Family doesn't create fake debts. And family certainly doesn't try to scare an old man into paying money he doesn't owe. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of my refrigerator and the distant sound of morning traffic. Carlos uncrossed his arms, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Sarah's tears had dried, completely replaced by something harder, more desperate. You have until Monday, Carlos said finally, his voice carrying a threat that hadn't been there before. 400,000, or we all lose everything. No, I said quietly, but the word carried the weight of 30 years spent making critical engineering decisions. I won't be paying debts I didn't create, and I won't be intimidated in my own home. Carlos's face darkened, but I held up a hand before he could speak. However, I'm willing to help you find a real solution to whatever financial trouble you're actually in. We can sit down, look at your legitimate debts, maybe work out a payment plan, or find a debt counselor. There's no time for that. Sarah interrupted her voice, rising with what sounded like genuine panic. Dad, you don't understand. These people don't negotiate. They don't care about payment plans. They want their money Monday or they start taking assets. I studied my daughter's face, noting the practiced timing of her distress. Sarah, sweetheart, listen to me. These documents are forgeries. Sophisticated ones, but forgeries nonetheless. No legitimate creditor would accept them as valid once they're properly examined. You're wrong, Carlos stepped closer to my kitchen table, his presence suddenly more menacing. Those signatures are yours. Your social security number, your address, your mother's maiden name for the security questions. How else would someone get all that information? The question hung in the air like smoke, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. He was right about one thing: the personal information required to create these accounts was extensive and specific. Someone would need intimate knowledge of my financial history, my personal details, even my handwriting patterns. Who else has access to your personal information, Dad? Sarah's voice had taken on a different quality, now less desperate daughter and more interrogation. Who else knows your social security number, your mother's maiden name, all those security questions the banks ask? The implication was clear, and it hit me like a physical blow. I looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and saw something I'd been too trusting to notice before. The tears had stopped completely. Her posture had changed from pleading to calculating. Even her voice had shifted, becoming more controlled, more purposeful. You knew, I said, the realization forming even as I spoke the words. You knew these were forged when you brought them here. Sarah's mask slipped for just a moment, and I saw something cold and desperate in her eyes. Dad, please. We're family. Family takes care of each other. Remember what you always told me growing up. Family first, always family first. I also taught you the difference between right and wrong, I replied, my voice steady, despite the betrayal burning in my chest. This isn't family helping family. This is fraud. It's survival, Carlos snapped, moving around the table until he was directly across from me. You think we wanted it to come to this? You think we had choices? There are always choices, I said, but even as I spoke, I was mentally cataloging the personal information they would have needed. Bank statements I'd left on my desk when they'd helped me organize my finances last year. The spare key I'd given Sarah for emergencies. The times I'd asked her to help with online banking when my arthritis was acting up. Sarah's voice had gone quiet, almost conversational. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've got plenty of choices. You've got this house, your pension, your savings. You've been living comfortably while Carlos and I have been struggling just to keep our heads above water. There was something in her tone that made my skin crawl, a sense of entitlement that I'd never heard before, or perhaps had never allowed myself to hear. Sarah, I've helped you both multiple times. The security deposit on your apartment, Carlos's truck payments, when he was between jobs, your credit card debt last Christmas. Helped. Carlos laughed, but there was no humor in it. You call throwing us a few $100s here and there helping. while you sit in this house that's worth $300,000, acting like you're doing us some huge favor. This house is my home, I said, standing up from the table. I've lived here for 26 years. I raised you in this house, Sarah. And now it's time to take care of the family that took care of you, she replied, her voice taking on that same cold calculation I'd glimpsed earlier. Think about everything we've done for you since Mom died. Who helped you learn to use online banking? Who organized your paperwork? Who made sure you weren't getting scammed by contractors or repair services? The words stung because they contained enough truth to make me doubt myself. Sarah had been helpful after Margaret's death, stepping in to assist with tasks that had always been my wife's domain. But now, listening to her weaponize that help, I began to see it differently. I never asked you to do those things so you could use them against me later, I said quietly. We're not using anything against you, Sarah's voice cracked with what might have been genuine emotion or might have been another performance. We're asking you to save your family. Carlos is in real trouble, Dad. The kind of trouble that doesn't go away with payment plans or debt counselors. Carlos nodded grimly. These aren't credit card companies we're dealing with. These are people who break kneecaps first and ask questions later. People who don't care about your engineering analysis or your magnifying glass examinations. Then maybe Carlos should have thought about that before he started gambling, I said, my patience finally wearing thin. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Carlos's hands clenched into fists on my kitchen table, and Sarah's face went through a rapid series of expressions. Surprise, hurt, anger, and finally something that looked almost like relief. So that's it, she said, her voice now completely devoid of the pleading tone she'd been using. Your own daughter asks for help, and you just turn your back. I offered to help with legitimate debts and real solutions, I replied. I won't participate in fraud, even for family. Carlos stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against my tile floor. You know what, old man? Maybe it's time you understood exactly what kind of situation we're all in here. What happened next unfolded in slow motion, yet was over in seconds. Sarah moved toward my coffee pot with jerky, deliberate steps, her face twisted into an expression I'd never seen before, pure, calculated rage. The woman who used to curl up next to me on the couch to watch cartoons had become someone I didn't recognize. You selfish bastard, she hissed, grabbing the glass carafe. Steam rose from the dark liquid inside, and I could smell the rich aroma that had been so comforting just minutes earlier. 34 years I've been your daughter. 34 years of putting up with your stubborn, self-righteous attitude. Sarah, calm down, calm down. The coffee pot trembled in her hands, and I could see the rage building behind her eyes like pressure in a boiler. My husband is about to get his legs broken. We're about to lose everything we have. And you're sitting there acting like this is some engineering problem you can solve with your magnifying glass. I took a step back, suddenly aware of how small my kitchen felt, with Carlos blocking the doorway and Sarah wielding hot coffee like a weapon. We can figure this out together as a family. Family, Sarah's laugh was sharp and bitter. You want to talk about family? Family helps each other. Family doesn't abandon each other when things get tough. The coffee pot was moving before I could react, arcing through the air in a perfect trajectory toward my chest. I saw it coming but couldn't move fast enough. The scalding liquid hit me like liquid fire, soaking through my shirt and undershirt in an instant. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, like someone had pressed a branding iron against my ribs. I gasped and stumbled backward, pulling the wet fabric away from my skin, but the damage was done. The coffee had been fresh, nearly boiling, and it had found every inch of my chest and upper abdomen. Through the haze of pain, I heard Sarah's voice, cold and matter-of-fact. Get out, Dad. This is our house now. This is my house, I managed, though my voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The burns were already starting to blister, and I could feel the heat radiating through my entire torso. Carlos stepped forward, and for the first time I noticed the tattoos covering his forearms' crude prison work that I'd somehow overlooked before. Not anymore, old man. See, here's what you don't understand about our situation. I'm not just behind on some credit cards. I'm facing 18 months in federal prison for check fraud, and my trial starts next month. The words hit me almost as hard as the coffee had. Prison third, strike two, which means if I get convicted, I'm looking at serious time. Carlos's voice was calm, almost conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. But if I can pay off the right people, make some debts disappear, maybe my lawyer can work out a plea deal. Sarah stood beside him, still holding the empty coffee pot, her chest heaving with exertion and rage. So you see, Dad, this isn't about gambling debts. This is about keeping my husband out of prison. And if that means you lose your precious house, well, that's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. The pain in my chest was nothing compared to the realization of how completely I'd been betrayed. My daughter, the little girl I'd raised alone after her mother died, the woman I'd walked down the aisle 3 years ago, was willing to destroy me to save a criminal. You have 5 minutes to pack whatever you can carry, Carlos said, checking his watch. After that, we changed the locks. I stumbled out my back door with nothing but the clothes on my back, and my wallet, the scalding coffee still burning through my shirt. The October morning air cut through the wet fabric, like ice, making the burns ache even more. But I couldn't think about pain right now. I needed help, and I needed it fast. Helen Rodriguez was watering her desert roses when she saw me climbing over the low fence that separated our properties. At 72, she had the sharp eyes of someone who'd spent 30 years managing high school students, and she immediately knew something was wrong. "Timothy, what happened to you?" She dropped her watering can and hurried toward me, her face creased with concern. "My daughter and her husband," I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. "They attacked me in my own kitchen. I need to call the police, but first I need to get these burns looked at." Helen didn't ask questions. She simply took my arm and guided me toward her back door. "Come on, let's get you cleaned up. Then we'll figure out what to do next." Her kitchen smelled like cinnamon and coffee, the good kind, the kind shared between friends rather than used as a weapon. She helped me carefully remove my shirt, her expression growing grimmer as she saw the extent of the burns across my chest and abdomen. "This is assault, Timothy, pure and simple." She ran cool water over clean towels and gently pressed them against the worst of the burns. What could possibly have made Sarah do something like this? As Helen tended to my injuries, I told her everything. The forged documents, the $400 0 inches fake gambling debts, Carlos's upcoming trial for check fraud, and Sarah's complete transformation from desperate daughter to calculating criminal. Helen listened without interruption, her face growing harder with each detail. "We need to document everything," she said when I finished. "Every burn, every document, every threat they made. And we need to do it before they have time to destroy evidence or disappear." I looked at this woman who'd been my neighbor for 15 years, who'd brought me casseroles after Margaret's funeral, and helped me figure out my new smart TV, and realized I was seeing her in an entirely new light. This wasn't just a retired school principal. This was someone who understood how to handle a crisis. "Helen, there's something else I need to tell you," I said, testing the words in my mouth. "Something that might change our options considerably." She raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I'm not as financially vulnerable as Sarah and Carlos think I am." I pulled out my phone, navigating to my blog's dashboard. "I've been running a food blog for the past 3 years. Desert Flavors. It's been more successful than I ever imagined." Helen's eyes widened as I showed her the revenue reports. "The partnership offers the monthly income statements." "Timothy, this is incredible. You're making more from this blog than most people make at full-time jobs. $3,000 a month, sometimes more during peak restaurant seasons. Combined with my pension and Social Security, I'm actually doing better financially than I have in years." I scrolled through more screens, showing her the business banking account. I'd set up the tax records, the professional correspondence with food industry contacts. "Why didn't you tell anyone about this?" "Margaret always resented my expensive hobbies, and after she died, I found I liked having something that was entirely mine. Sarah's been so worried about my finances, constantly offering to help with bills." I trailed off, realizing how naive that sounded now. I thought I was protecting her from worrying about me. Helen shook her head, but she was smiling. "You realize what this means, don't you? You have resources they don't know about. Professional contacts, financial independence, the ability to hire the best legal representation available." The implications were starting to sink in. I wasn't a helpless elderly victim living on a fixed income. I was a successful business owner with a growing online presence, and the financial means to fight back properly. "We need to get back to your house," Helen said, standing up and reaching for her car keys. "Right now, while they're probably celebrating their victory, we need to photograph everything. The documents, the coffee stains, any evidence of what happened in that kitchen." 20 minutes later, we were parked across the street from my house, watching for signs of Sarah and Carlos. Helen had insisted on coming with me, claiming she needed to serve as an independent witness to whatever we found. "Their car's gone," I observed, noting the empty driveway. "They probably went somewhere to celebrate, or maybe to figure out their next move." We used my spare key to enter through the front door. The kitchen looked exactly as we'd left it. Documents scattered across the table, the empty coffee pot still sitting on the counter, dark stains on the floor where the scalding liquid had splashed. Helen took photos with her phone while I gathered the forged documents, being careful to handle them only by the edges. My engineer's training kicked in automatically preserved the evidence, document everything, maintain chain of custody. Look at this, Helen said, pointing to a notebook that had been left open on my counter. Carlos's handwriting was clearly visible, with what looked like a timeline of events and a list of my personal information. Social security number, mother's maiden name, even the answers to security questions I'd used for various online accounts. They were planning this for months, I said, photographing each page. This isn't desperation. This is premeditated fraud. We spent an hour documenting everything, and by the time we finished, I had over 50 photographs and a manila folder full of evidence. More importantly, I had a clear understanding of just how extensive their scheme had been. Now we call my attorney, I said, pulling out my phone. Frank Morrison specializes in elder law, and he's handled fraud cases before. Helen smiled as I dialed the number. Timothy, I have to say, I'm impressed. Most people would be hiding in their bedroom right now, crying about what their family did to them. I spent 30 years solving complex engineering problems, I replied, listening to Frank's phone ring. This is just another problem that needs a systematic solution. Frank Morrison's office overlooked downtown Phoenix, and his walls were lined with certificates and awards, recognizing his expertise in elder law. At 58, he'd built his reputation defending seniors against financial exploitation, and his expression grew grimmer as I laid out the evidence Helen and I had gathered. Timothy, this is textbook elder abuse, he said, examining the photographs of the forged documents through his reading glasses. Identity theft, forgery, assault, attempted extortion. We're looking at multiple felonies here, both state and federal. He spread the photos across his conference table like a prosecutor preparing for trial. The sophistication of this fraud is remarkable. They had access to your most private information, your handwriting samples, even your behavioral patterns. This took months of planning. What are my options, I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. 2 paths, Frank replied, leaning back in his leather chair. Civil litigation, where we sue for damages and try to recover your losses. Or criminal prosecution, where we work with law enforcement to put these people in prison where they belong. Helen, who'd insisted on accompanying me to provide witness testimony, spoke up from her chair beside me. What's the difference in outcomes? Civil court means money. Criminal court means justice. Frank's voice carried the weight of 30 years handling these cases. In civil litigation, even if we win, there's no guarantee they'll have assets to pay a judgment. But criminal prosecution means real consequences, prison time, permanent criminal records, and protection for other potential victims. I thought about Carlos's casual mention of his upcoming trial, his matter-of-fact discussion of breaking kneecaps and making debts disappear. They're not going to stop with me, are they? Predators like this rarely limit themselves to one victim, Frank confirmed. Your daughter and son-in-law have demonstrated a willingness to commit serious crimes against family members. What do you think they'll do to strangers? The question hung in the air like a challenge. I looked at the evidence spread across Frank's table. The forged signatures, the coffee stains on my shirt captured in Helen's photographs, the notebook containing my personal information in Carlos's handwriting. There's something else you should know, Frank continued, pulling out a legal pad covered with notes. I made some calls while you were driving over here. Carlos Martinez has a record. 2 prior convictions for check fraud, currently out on bail pending trial for a 3rd offense. If he's convicted on these new charges, he's looking at serious federal time. And Sarah. As a first-time offender, she'd likely face probation and restitution on the fraud charges. But the assault with the coffee pot, that's a different story. Domestic violence against an elderly family member carries enhanced penalties in Arizona. I closed my eyes, trying to reconcile the legal terminology with the reality of my daughter's actions. When I opened them, Frank was studying me with the patient expression of someone who'd guided hundreds of families through similar decisions. I know this is difficult, Timothy. But I need you to understand something. This isn't about revenge. This is about accountability. It's about preventing them from doing this to someone else's father or grandfather. Helen reached over and squeezed my hand. What does your gut tell you? I thought about my quiet morning routine, my successful blog, the peaceful retirement I'd built for myself after Margaret's death. Then I thought about Sarah's cold calculation as she threw scalding coffee at me. Carlos's casual threats about changing my locks. They crossed a line, I said finally. Not just with the fraud, but with the violence. If I don't stop them now, they'll keep escalating until someone gets seriously hurt. Frank nodded approvingly. Then, we proceed with criminal charges. I'll contact Detective Maria Santos at Phoenix PD. She heads their elder abuse unit. We'll need to file a police report and turn over all this evidence. How long will this take? With evidence this comprehensive, they could be arrested as early as tomorrow morning. The next morning, Detective Maria Santos arrived at Frank's office with the kind of professional competence that immediately put me at ease. In her mid-40s, with graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, she had the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen every type of family betrayal imaginable. Mr. Lewis, I've reviewed the preliminary evidence your attorney forwarded, she said, settling into the conference room chair across from me. I have to say, in 15 years of investigating elder abuse cases, I've rarely seen documentation this thorough. Helen, who'd insisted on being present for the entire process, smiled with satisfaction. Timothy has an engineering background. He approaches problems systematically. Detective Santos spread my photographs across the table, examining each one with the methodical attention of a professional investigator. These forgery examples are textbook evidence. The handwriting analysis alone will be enough for prosecution, but combined with the assault documentation and the planning materials you found. She shook her head appreciatively. This is a prosecutor's dream case. What happens now? I asked, though I was beginning to feel more confident about the answer. We execute search and arrest warrants. Based on this evidence, I can have both warrants signed within the hour. She pulled out her phone and began typing. Are they still at your residence? I nodded. As far as I know, they seemed pretty confident they'd gotten away with it. Detective Santos's smile was sharp. That confidence is about to become a liability. Most criminals in cases like this assume their elderly victims won't fight back, won't understand the legal system, won't have the resources to mount a proper defense. They certainly assume that about me, I admitted. Which brings me to something I'm curious about. She looked up from her phone. Your attorney mentioned you have financial resources they weren't aware of. That's unusual in elder abuse cases. Most victims are chosen specifically because they're financially vulnerable. I explained about the blog, the monthly income, the business relationships I'd built in the food industry. Detective Santos listened with growing interest. So they thought they were targeting a lonely widower on a fixed income, but they actually picked a successful business owner with professional connections and the means to hire excellent legal representation. That's about the size of it, Helen said, clearly enjoying the irony. 2 hours later, we were parked across the street from my house, in Detective Santos's unmarked car, watching as a team of uniformed officers positioned themselves around the property. Through my kitchen window, I could see Sarah moving around, probably making herself breakfast with my food in my kitchen. There's something satisfying about this, I said quietly. Detective Santos glanced at me in the rearview mirror. Justice usually is Mr. Lewis, especially when it's this well-deserved. The front door opened, and Carlos emerged in his work clothes, probably heading to whatever construction job he'd managed to find. He made it exactly 3 steps before 2 officers approached him from either side. Carlos Martinez, you're under arrest for identity theft, fraud, and assault. Even from across the street, I could see the shock on his face as the handcuffs clicked into place. He'd been so confident, so sure that his intimidation tactics had worked. The look of complete bewilderment as he was read, his rights was almost worth the coffee burns. Sarah appeared in the doorway, and her scream of "What's happening?" carried clearly across the quiet suburban street. A female officer approached her with a second set of handcuffs. Sarah Lewis Martinez, you're under arrest for identity theft, fraud, assault, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. This was the moment I'd been both anticipating and dreading. Watching my daughter being arrested was painful, but seeing her complete shock as she realized her scheme had backfired was deeply satisfying. She kept looking around as if expecting someone to intervene, someone to explain that this was all a mistake. They really thought you'd just disappear quietly, Detective Santos observed. Most elder abuse victims do. They're too ashamed, too confused, or too isolated to fight back effectively. I had advantages they didn't know about, I said, watching as both Sarah and Carlos were loaded into separate patrol cars. Financial resources, professional connections, and a very smart neighbor who knew exactly what to do. Helen squeezed my shoulder from the front seat. Don't sell yourself short, Timothy. You're the one who recognized the forgeries. You're the one who documented everything systematically. You're the one who chose justice over family loyalty. As the patrol cars pulled away with my daughter and son-in-law in custody, I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. Not satisfaction, not revenge, but simple relief that the lies were finally over. Detective Santos turned to face me. The search team will need about an hour to process your house and collect any additional evidence. After that, you'll be free to return home. What happens next? Arraignment hearings probably tomorrow morning. Bail hearings after that, though given the flight risk and Carlos's pending trial, I suspect they'll both remain in custody. She consulted her notes. The prosecutor will want to meet with you later this week to discuss plea negotiations, though with evidence this strong, I doubt they'll be in any position to negotiate. An hour later, I stood in my own kitchen for the first time since yesterday morning's attack. The coffee stains had been photographed and sampled as evidence, but I could still smell the lingering aroma of violence and betrayal. First thing we're doing is changing these locks, Helen announced, pulling out her phone. I know a locksmith who can be here within the hour. I looked around my house, not theirs, and realized that for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt completely at peace with my surroundings. The people who'd been violating my boundaries, manipulating my emotions, and stealing my resources were gone. You know what I said, opening my laptop and navigating to my blog dashboard. I think it's time I wrote about yesterday's experience. Not the family drama, but the restaurant Frank took us to for lunch. That little place downtown with the excellent green chile stew. Helen laughed. Back to normal already, better than normal, I replied, beginning to type. For the first time in years, I get to be exactly who I am, without having to hide my success or apologize for my boundaries. 3 months later, I sat in my home office reviewing the final court documents that had arrived in yesterday's mail. Carlos Martinez, 18 months in federal prison for identity theft and check fraud plus 3 years supervised probation. Sarah Lewis Martinez, 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and $15 0 inches restitution payments to be made over 5 years. The justice system had worked exactly as Frank Morrison had predicted. Carlos's prior convictions and pending trial had eliminated any possibility of a plea deal, while Sarah's cooperation with prosecutors had earned her a sentence that avoided prison time but ensured she'd be paying for her choices for years to come. I folded the documents and filed them in the cabinet where I kept all my legal correspondence. A cabinet that had grown considerably thicker over the past few months. Detective Santos had been right about one thing: comprehensive documentation made everything easier for everyone involved. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen. Phoenix Magazine wants to interview you about the blog. Are you ready to go public? I smiled as I typed back. More than ready. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years, I'd kept my food blog success secret, worried about family judgment and uncomfortable with attention. Now, after Sarah and Carlos had tried to steal everything I'd worked for, I was finally ready to claim credit for what I'd accomplished. The Phoenix New Times had run a small story about the elder abuse case 2 weeks ago, focusing on the importance of systematic evidence gathering and community support in protecting vulnerable seniors. They'd mentioned my blog only in passing, but it was enough to generate interest from other local media outlets. Desert Flavors now had 15000 regular readers and partnerships with 8 major restaurants in the Phoenix-Scottsdale area. My monthly income had grown to nearly $4,500, and I'd been invited to judge a prestigious culinary competition next month. At 68, I was more professionally successful than I'd ever been during my engineering career. But the real change wasn't financial, it was personal. I no longer felt the need to hide my accomplishments or apologize for my boundaries. The house was entirely mine again, reorganized to suit my preferences, and protected by a security system that Helen had insisted I install. The spare bedroom had been converted into a proper photography studio for my food blog, complete with professional lighting and camera equipment. Helen knocked on my back door, carrying what looked like a casserole dish and wearing the satisfied expression of someone bearing good news. Community Center wants you to teach a class, she announced, setting the dish on my kitchen counter. Financial literacy for seniors, with a focus on recognizing and preventing family fraud. I considered the offer while Helen uncovered what turned out to be her famous green chile enchiladas. I suppose I do have some relevant experience in that area. Relevant experience, Helen laughed. Timothy, you've become the poster child for senior empowerment in this neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down asked me to introduce her to you because she's been having problems with her grandson's girlfriend asking for money. The idea of becoming a community resource for other seniors facing family exploitation was both flattering and slightly overwhelming. But as I thought about Detective Santos's words about predators rarely limiting themselves to one victim, I realized this might be exactly the kind of second career I'd been unconsciously preparing for. What would the class cover? Document security, recognizing manipulation tactics, building support networks, knowing when to involve law enforcement. Helen counted off the topics on her fingers. All the things you did right, basically. Over lunch, we discussed the logistics of the proposed class. The community center had space available on Tuesday evenings, and they estimated 15 to 20 participants for the first session. Helen had already volunteered to help with registration and materials. "You know what this means, don't you?" she said as we finished eating. "What? You're going to need business cards." Timothy Lewis, food critic and senior advocate. I laughed, but the idea wasn't entirely unappealing. My engineering career had been about solving structural problems, calculating loads, analyzing stress points, ensuring stability. This new role would involve similar skills applied to personal and financial security. That evening, I updated my blog with a review of a new Mediterranean restaurant in Old Town Scottsdale, complete with professional photographs and detailed tasting notes. The comments section filled up within hours, readers praising the thoroughness of my analysis, asking for recommendations for special occasions, sharing their own dining experiences. At the bottom of the post, I added something I'd never included before, a brief author bio mentioning my background in engineering and my recent work in senior advocacy. For the first time, I was presenting myself as the complete person I actually was, rather than hiding parts of my identity out of misplaced modesty or fear of judgment. My phone rang as I was preparing for bed. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but the voice was familiar. "Mr. Lewis, this is Detective Santos. I hope I'm not calling too late." "Not at all. What can I do for you?" "I wanted to let you know that your case has been selected as a training example for our elder abuse unit. The systematic way you documented everything the community support network you activated, it's exactly what we want other victims to understand is possible." I felt a surge of pride that surprised me with its intensity. "I'm honored. There's something else. Would you be interested in speaking at our next community outreach event? We're trying to educate seniors about recognizing and preventing financial exploitation." I looked around my home office at the awards and certificates from my engineering career displayed alongside printouts of positive blog reviews and the legal documents that had restored my peace of mind. Everything in this room represented some aspect of who I was: problem solver, creative professional, survivor, advocate. "Detective Santos," I said I'd be delighted to help. After we hung up, I walked through my house, turning off lights and checking locks with the same methodical precision I'd always applied to evening routines. But now, instead of feeling lonely or isolated, I felt connected to a community that valued my contributions and respected my boundaries. Tomorrow I'd start working on the curriculum for Helen's proposed class. Next week I'd meet with Phoenix Magazine about the interview. Next month I'd judge that culinary competition and speak at Detective Santos's community event. At 68, I was finally living the life I'd always been capable of, successful, respected, and completely authentically myself. Sometimes the greatest betrayals come from those we love most, but they also reveal strengths we never knew we possessed. Timothy's story reminds us that age doesn't mean vulnerability, and quiet people often carry the deepest wells of resilience. When family turns against us, community steps forward. When manipulation tries to break us, systematic thinking can save us. The engineering mindset that served Timothy in his career became his salvation in crisis. Analyze the problem, gather evidence, build solutions methodically. True family isn't defined by blood, but by respect, honesty, and genuine care. Timothy found more family in neighbor Helen's kitchen than he ever had in Sarah's manipulation. His transformation from hidden blogger to community advocate shows us that our second acts can be our greatest performances, and that standing up for ourselves often means standing up for others who can't yet find their voice. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.